It wasn't the betrayal of a friend. It wasn't the ambition of a tyrant. It wasn't even the restoration of a republic. It was the removal of the only structural constraint on total chaos. The history books focus on the knives. They focus on the drama of the Senate floor. They focus on the personalities of Brutus and Cassius, but they miss the arithmetic. They miss the economic vacuum created the moment the body fell. When Julius Caesar died, the illusion of solvency died with him. Rome was not a healthy republic. It was a fracturing empire, drowning in the costs of expansion. It was a system where the oligarchy had captured all the land. It was a system where the currency was the only thing holding the legions. Together, Caesar was the cap on the bottle. He was the centralized authority that kept the factions from tearing the treasury apart. When that authority vanished, the restraints vanished. The pattern is unmistakable. It happens in every empire that loses its political center first. Comes the political assassination, or collapse. Then comes the power vacuum. Then comes the civil war. Then comes the bill. And the bill is always paid in the same way. Not with taxes. Taxes are too unpopular. Taxes cause rebellions. The bill is paid by destroying the currency. The bill is paid by erasing the middle class. The bill is paid by the slow grinding theft of purchasing power. This is not a story about ancient history. This is a story about the mechanics of power and money. It is a story about what happens when a state loses the ability to govern itself. The incentives are timeless. The mathematics are merciless. When the political center fails, the printing press or the coin clipper takes over. The assassination of Caesar was not the end of tyranny. It was the beginning of the great debasement. It was the trigger for a cycle of inflation and confiscation that would eventually destroy the Western world. We see this pattern repeat in three distinct historical epochs. We see it in the aftermath of the Roman civil wars. We see it in the collapse of the Spanish Habsburgs. We see it in the tragedy of Weimar Germany. The arithmetic does not care about your ideology. It does not care about your intentions. It only cares about the deficit between what the state spends and what the state earns. And when the strong man falls, that deficit explodes. Here is how the mechanism works. Most observers agree that the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC was the catalyst for the death of the Roman economy, not just its political system. To understand why, we must look at the immediate financial aftermath of the Ides of March. The conspirators believed that by removing the dictator, they would restore the old norms of the republic. Instead, they unleashed a fiscal nightmare that required centuries of currency manipulation to fix. The immediate result was not liberty. It was liquidity separation. The Roman world was instantly plunged into a series of civil wars that were far more expensive than the campaigns Caesar had waged in Gaul. Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus formed the Second Triumvirate, and their primary problem was not military strategy, but payroll. They had tens of thousands of legionaries who needed to be paid, fed, and equipped. The treasury in the Temple of Saturn was insufficient to meet these demands, especially with the tax revenues from the provinces, disrupted by the chaos. The incentive structure shifted overnight. Under a stable, albeit authoritarian rule, the incentive is to maintain the value of the currency, to promote trade and stability. In a civil war, the incentive is survival at any cost. The rational move for the triumvirate was to abandon fiscal discipline entirely. They began with proscriptions, the state-sanctioned murder of wealthy citizens, to seize their assets. This is the assets. Crudest form of capital control. If you had land, gold, or silver, you were a target. The state simply took what it needed to pay the troops. But confiscation has a limit. You can only seize so much land before the economy grinds to a halt. So the Roman state turned to the second lever, debasement. This is where the true rot began. Under the Republic and early Caesar, the silver denarius was a standard of purity, roughly 95 to 98% silver. It was trusted across the Mediterranean. It was the dollar of the ancient world. But as the costs of the imperial infrastructure and the standing armies grew, the temptation to cheat the math became irresistible. The process was slow at first, almost imperceptible. Nero facing the costs of rebuilding Rome after the Great Fire and maintaining the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, reduced the silver content to roughly 90%. He also reduced the weight of the coin. To the average shopkeeper or legionary, the coin looked the same. It had the emperor's face, it had the official stamp, but it was worth less. This was the ancient equivalent of quantitative easing. By mixing base metals like copper into the silver melt, the state could mint more coins with the same amount of precious metal. Think about what that means for the saver. A centurion who retired under Augustus with a pension denominated in denarii thought he was secure, but by the time of Marcus Aurelius, the silver content had dropped to around 75%. By the time of Septimius Severus in the early 3rd century, it was down to 50%. The state was stealing half of every transaction, half of every savings pot, simply by altering the chemistry of the money, the human cost of it. This was the destruction of the Roman middle class. We have records from the time letters, from soldiers' graffiti in the marketplaces complaining about the rising price of wheat wine and olive oil. A measure of wheat that cost 7 or 8 drachmae in the 2nd century would cost 120,000 drachmae by the middle of the 3rd century. This hyperinflation didn't happen overnight, but it accelerated as political stability collapsed. The crisis of the 3rd century was the culmination of the pattern Caesar's death initiated emperors were assassinated with brutal regularity. Every new claimant to the throne had to bribe the legions to secure loyalty. The only way to pay the bribe was to debase the currency further. By the year 270 AD, under Emperor Aurelian, the denarius had been replaced by the antoninianus, a coin that was essentially copper with a thin silver wash, barely 5% purity. The money had become tokenized. It was fiat currency in whole but name. The result was a flight to hard assets. The wealthy stopped holding currency. They bought vast tracts of land, creating the latifundia, the giant estates that would eventually evolve into feudal manors. They withdrew from the commercial economy. Trade collapsed because no one trusted the medium of exchange. The complex interconnected economy of the Pax Romana disintegrated into local subsistence farming. The middle class, the merchants, the artisans, the small landholders were wiped out. They could not hedge against inflation. They were priced out of existence, forced to sell their labor and their freedom to the great landowners just to survive. The assassination of political stability led directly to the enslavement of the populace. Just like Rome, the Spanish Empire in the 16th and 17th centuries fell victim to the same illusion that political power could override economic reality. Spain had discovered the ultimate source of liquidity, the New World. The mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico were churning out silver on a scale the world had never seen. The Spanish galleons arrived in Seville, filled to the gunwales with bullion. To the Spanish crown, specifically the Habsburg monarchs, like Philip II, this looked like infinite wealth. It looked like they had solved the problem of financing the state forever, but they had confused money with wealth. The influx of silver did not create productive capacity. It did not build factories or improve agriculture in Castile. Instead, it fueled an imperial overextension that was breathtaking in its scope. Spain was fighting wars on every front. Against the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, against the rebels in the Netherlands, against the English in the Atlantic and the Sea, against the French on the continent. These wars were the Spanish equivalent of the Roman legions. Fixed massive cost that had to be paid in hard currency. The incentive for the Spanish crown was to spend the silver before it even arrived. They borrowed heavily from German and Genoese bankers, using the future shipments of the treasure fleet as collateral. This is the early modern version of deficit spending. They were monetizing their future revenue streams to pay for current military adventures. The massive influx of silver devalued the metal itself. A pair of shoes that cost a few maravedis in the early 1500s cost hundreds a century later. For the Spanish peasant or the minor nobility, this was a catastrophe. The wealth of the empire was passing right through Spain, landing in the hands of the bankers in Genoa, or the merchants in Amsterdam, who sold goods to the Spanish Spain, became a hollow conduit for silver, not a repository of wealth. The crown's response to the fiscal pressure was to default. Philip II, the most powerful man in the world, declared state bankruptcy 4 times. In 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596. Each time the state simply refused to pay its debts or unilaterally restructured them. This destroyed the credit markets. It destroyed the merchant class in Spain. We have accounts from the time describing the streets of Seville and Madrid. They describe a strange paradox. Gold and silver were everywhere, yet the people were starving. The fields were lying fallow because it was cheaper to import grain from abroad using the overvalued silver than to grow it at home. The domestic economy was hollowed out by the very resource that was supposed to make it rich. The climax of this dysfunction was the introduction of vellone coinage, copper coins, stamped with arbitrary values to replace the silver that had flowed out of the country. By the mid-17th century, the Spanish monarchy was forcing its citizens to trade in worthless copper tokens, while the king used the real silver to pay foreign mercenaries. The result was the total collapse of Spanish power. The empire that owned the world went bankrupt because it believed it could print or dig its way out of structural deficits. Just like Spain, the Weimar Republic in early 20th century, Germany demonstrates what happens when the political center is violently removed and the printing press becomes the only tool of governance. The common narrative of the Weimar hyperinflation is that it was caused solely by the Treaty of Versailles and war reparations. While those were massive constraints, the trigger for the terminal phase of the collapse was political. In 1922, the German Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau was assassinated by right-wing extremists. They ordered workers to strike, and they paid their wages with newly printed marks. The numbers from this period are so large, they become abstract, but we must look at them to understand the velocity of the collapse. By November 1923, $1 was worth 42 trillion marks. We have diaries of women who would rush to the bakery the moment their husbands were paid, because the price of bread would double by the evening. We have stories of pensioners who had saved for a lifetime to buy a small cottage, only to find their entire life savings could not buy a cup of coffee. Their assets were in paper, and paper became worthless. Those who survived and those who thrived were those who understood the pattern. The industrialist Hugo Stinnes is the classic example. He understood that in a period of political collapse and monetary debasement, debt is an asset and cash is a liability. He became the king of inflation, owning a significant chunk of the German economy, while the average citizen starved. The destruction of the currency broke the social contract. It created the vacuum that allowed for the rise of a totalitarian regime that promised order at any price. The road to the darker chapters of the 20th century was paved with worthless paper marks. The pattern repeats in 7 distinct stages. Stage 1 is sound money and stability. The nation has a hard currency, usually backed by gold or silver, or a fiat currency backed by immense industrial output and military hegemony. Government runs small deficits or surpluses. The political center is strong. Stage 2 is overextension. The nation expands its commitments. This could be imperial conquest, as with Rome and Spain, or the construction of a massive welfare state and military complex. The costs begin to outpace the natural growth of the economy. Stage 3 is the fiscal turning point. The state can no longer pay for its commitments through taxation alone. Political polarization makes raising taxes impossible. The government begins to borrow, heavily issuing debt to cover the gap. The interest payments on the debt begin to consume a larger portion of the budget. Stage 4 is debasement. The debt burden becomes unmanageable. The government faces a choice: default honestly or default dishonestly. They always choose the dishonest route. In Spain, it was minting copper. In the modern era, it is central bank monetization, printing money to buy the government's own debt. This suppresses interest rates and keeps the game going, but it structurally weakens the currency. Stage 5 is price inflation. The newly created money enters the real economy. But eventually, it leaks into essential goods. Food, energy, and housing costs rise faster than wages. Stage 6 is social fracture. As inflation erodes the standard of living, the middle class begins to slide into poverty. The gap between the asset holders, who are protected by inflation, and the wage earners, who are crushed by it, widens to breaking point. Political extremism rises. Scapegoating becomes the primary political tool. The center collapses. Stage 7 is the reset. The system becomes mathematically impossible to sustain. The currency is either destroyed completely, hyperinflation, or is revalued and restructured by government decree. Debts are wiped out, often along with the savings of the creditor class. A new currency is issued, usually with a hard anchor, to restore confidence, and the cycle begins again. Just like Rome in the 3rd century, and just like the Spanish Empire in the 17th, current data suggests the modern Western economies are deep within this cycle. Most objective observers would place the current trajectory somewhere between Stage 5 and Stage 6. The warning signs are visible in the arithmetic. The debt-to-GDP ratios of major Western sovereigns are at levels historically seen only during total war. The United States, the issuer of the global reserve currency, runs trillion-dollar deficits as a matter of routine, regardless of whether the economy is in recession or expansion. The political center that characterized the post-World War II era has fractured, making fiscal discipline politically impossible. No party can run on a platform of austerity. The only winning platform is more spending funded by more issuance. We see the debasement in the purchasing power of the currency, while official CPI numbers are often managed and smooth the price of hard assets. Housing, prime land, gold, fine art has skyrocketed over the last 2 decades. This is the modern equivalent of the Roman flight to the latifundia. The middle class is finding it increasingly impossible to buy a home, which is the primary vehicle for middle-class wealth preservation. When a house earns more in appreciation than a worker earns in wages, the social contract is breaking. One counter-argument often raised is that modern central banks have tools that Roman emperors did not. They have sophisticated models, digital control, and the ability to coordinate globally. Economists argue that secular stagnation or technological deflation allows for higher debt loads without the risk of hyperinflation. They argue that because the debt is denominated in the nation's own currency, technical default is impossible. However, the incentives and the arithmetic rebut this optimism. While technical default, refusing to pay, is unlikely, the soft default of inflation is the rational political choice. The incentive for any government facing a debt wall is to print the difference. The constraints of the 21st century demographics, pension obligations, and healthcare costs are fixed and growing. The tax base is mobile and shrinking relative to the liabilities. Under these constraints, the rational move for the state is financial repression, keeping interest rates below the rate of inflation to slowly liquidate the real value of the debt. This is exactly what Rome did by shaving coins. It is a slow-motion confiscation of wealth from savers to the sovereign. The endgames proceed in a fixed order. The first endgame is controlled decline. The state uses capital controls, higher taxes, and financial repression to manage the descent. We see this in the form of yield curve control, or regulations that force pension funds to buy government debt. This buys time, perhaps a decade or two, but it results in a stagnant economy and a slowly impoverishing population. We saw this in the later years of the British Empire, post-1945, where capital controls were in place until 1979, and the pound lost its dominance. The second endgame is chaotic collapse. If the controlled decline fails, or if an external shock, war, pandemic, energy crisis, hits a levered system, confidence evaporates rapidly. The currency enters a death spiral. This is the Weimar or Zimbabwe scenario. It is rare in developed economies with diversified production, but it is the risk tail that grows fatter the longer the imbalances persist. The third endgame is reset and restructure. This is the inevitable destination. The old currency is retired or repegged. In 1948, Germany replaced the worthless Reichsmark with the Deutschmark. Citizens were allowed to exchange a limited amount at a 1-to-1 rate and the rest at a massive haircut. Savings were wiped out to clear the state's balance sheet. In the modern context, this could look like the introduction of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, which allow for a total restructuring of the monetary system, potentially including negative interest rates or programmable expiration of money to force velocity. The pattern is set. The precedents are clear. The structural deficits are locked in. The only variable is timing and pain. Subscribe to the channel. Do not rely on the systems that are currently fracturing to protect you. Education is your primary hedge. Understand the difference between currency and value. Build resilience in your skills, your community, and your control over your own resources. A history of Rome is not a tragedy to be watched from afar. It is a map. Study it